The poet Rabindranath Tagore supposedly said, "If you want to know India, study Vivekananda." There's no real evidence that he actually said it, but either way, he was right. Swami Vivekananda is the very soul of India, and not only of Hindu India. He was a Hindu guru who embodied the best spirit of Christianity and Islam as well. In his first speech on returning from the Chicago Parliament of the World's Religions, Vivekananda said that, quote, "If there is one word in the English language to express the effect which the literature of India produces upon mankind, it is this one word: fascination." Of course, when he said the literature of India, he meant the Vedas. But in the research for my new book, Dharma Democracy, I became even more fascinated by the independence era political literature of India. The Indian independence movement produced a literature that is far more voluminous and, in many ways, far more profound than the much more famous works of the American founding fathers. Yet I dare say that the American works are not only more famous in the United States, but even in India, because they sit at the core of the Western political science curriculum, which is still the dominant curriculum at some of India's most prestigious universities. I'm not a subaltern studies scholar who rails against Western intellectual colonialism. I'm just an academic who recognizes quality when I read it. And when I read it, I found the Indian political thought of the first half of the 20th century, well, fascinating. Of course, there's Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, and Savarkar. They may be the brand name authors, but they were all first and foremost politicians. Serious students of Indian political thought should also be reading Bipin Chandra Pal's essays on nationality and empire, which are some of the most provocative ruminations on the theory of nationhood ever written. They should be reading Tilak's speech on national education, which in 1908 raised the issue of English versus local language instruction. They should be reading Tagore's 1917 study of nationalism, which, in addition to chapters on Europe and India, includes one of the earliest studies of Japanese nationalism. And it's not only Indian students who should be reading these works. Like the American founding fathers before them, India's founding fathers tackled challenges that are universal in scope. Consider Paul's essays on nationality and empire. He argued in the 1910s that India could only remain a unified entity within the context of the British Empire. He said that without Muslim support for the idea of Indian nationhood, an independent India would collapse in civil disorder. Of course, he was right. 30 years after he wrote, British India was in fact partitioned to create Pakistan. But his arguments could equally well be applied to Africa and the Middle East as to India. In a similar vein, every country outside the Anglosphere must grapple with Tilak's question of whether to educate students in their own national languages or in English. And Tagore's study of nationalism is global in scope and timeless in spirit. He called the idea of the nation one of the most powerful anesthetics that man has invented. His book on nationalism is a moving indictment of the militarism that engulfed the world in the First World War and would soon engulf it in a second. I highlight these three authors, Bipin Chandra Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Rabindranath Tagore, not because they are insufficiently famous, but because they are insufficiently read, and almost never read outside India. I could cite many others. One reason it took me so long to research and write my new book, Dharma Democracy, was that there were just so much to read and so much to learn. Relatively little of what I read made its way into the book. I'm an empirical social scientist, not a political theorist, and my book focuses on facts and figures, not on intellectual history. Still, I couldn't help being inspired by Swami Vivekananda, who was my entry point into the study of Indian democracy. He gets a whole chapter in my book. Vivekananda recognized that you can't have a democracy until you have a nation to be democratic. He said that national unity must be based on, quote, the idea not only of toleration, but of sympathy. By this, he meant that people must not only learn to tolerate other people's religions, customs, and behaviors, but learn how to understand them and sympathize with them. This was a theme that Vivekananda returned to again and again in his ministry. He taught that, quote, we must become many-sided. Indeed, we must become protean in character so as not only to tolerate, but to do what is much more difficult, to sympathize. to enter into one another's path, and to feel with him in his aspirations and seeking after God. Vivekananda called this, quote, the one central truth that was preached only here in our motherland, and that has to be preached once more from India, before India could find its unity as a nation. And he said that in Colombo, make of that what you will. In his espousal of mutual sympathy and his distinctively uplifting way, Vivekananda encapsulated the principle of nationhood that is the prerequisite for any well-functioning democracy. We must sympathize with our neighbors, our fellow citizens, if we are to live peacefully in a single national community. In India, as in many Western democracies, that sympathy has at times been strained by events. The April 22nd terrorist attacks in Pahalgam were clearly designed to test the strength of intercommunal sympathy among Indians. With minor exceptions, India passed that test with distinction. Many other developing countries would do well to learn from India's example. That's why I wrote Dharma Democracy. It wasn't to teach Indians about India. It was to teach the world about the reasons behind India's democratic success. With this book, I've done my best to fulfill my own dharma as a scholar and as a teacher. You, who know so much more about India than I do, will have to judge whether or not I have succeeded. Dhanyavad. Jai Hind.